With a few simple adjustments, I took this person's split squat from looking like this to this. And I could do that because I understand the biomechanics behind this awesome exercise. If you know that, and you can modify it so just about anyone can do it and reap the benefits. This video will teach you the biomechanics, coaching, and modifications that you can make to unlock crazy mobility and strength gains with the split squat, one of the best lower body exercises out there. In general, the split squat has about an even load distribution between the front and back leg. Though as we go through the motion, more load should progressively shift to the lead leg. Pelvic and femoral movement changes throughout the range. At the top of the split squat, the sacrum and pelvis face away from the lead leg. This moves both femurs toward external rotation. And that's because external rotation occurs both in the early ranges of hip flexion and deep, as well as terminal hip extension, and that's due to the sacroiliac or SI joint movement of counternutation. That's where the sacrum tips backward and the innominates, or the pelvic bones, rotate outward toward external rotation. It's a small amount of motion, but it's important because it does affect muscle activity within the pelvic floor. That will impact your depth. As we move to the bottom of the split squat, the sacrum begins to rotate toward the lead leg, stopping near dead center. This creates an internal rotation bias at both legs as the hip flexes to 90 degrees and as it extends to 0 degrees of hip extension. There's more of an internal rotation action at both of those ranges. Now, trunk position also affects both loading and motion demands throughout the range. The more upright the trunk, the more the load is to the quad, and the greater the external rotation demands. Conversely, the more horizontal the trunk, the more the glutes and hamstrings get loaded. This increases the internal rotation demands. Now that we've gone over the basic split squat biomechanics, here's how to coach it so you can make sure that you're getting the motion and loading gains you so desire. If you're someone who mostly feels the back leg on this exercise, or you think that split squats are too easy, then we need to pay attention here. With coaching anything, there's a sequence that I run through to ensure that I can achieve both the motion and loading goals of any exercise. And that involves checking head position, ground contact, the breath, and the way the movements perform. Let's first look at head position. You want to make sure that where you are looking allows the rest of the trunk to move where you want it. For example, if you look up too high, you're going to be way too arched. And if you look down, your back going round and Zach going frown. The best place to look is to the relative horizon. This allows your body to have a nice middle ground in terms of not too flexed, not too extended. Getting all Goldilocks up in here. The next thing we'll look at is how the feet touch the ground. We want to have the foot achieving two goals for us. One, putting force into the ground both during the eccentric and concentric phase of the movement, or on the way down and on the way up. This helps drive movement toward the lead leg as we go down and away as we come up. And each foot should be doing slightly different things. The lead leg controls the eccentric and helps push us out of the bottom of the split squat. For that, we want to encourage the foot to pronate. The way we do that is thinking about using an off-balance tripod foot. What I mean by that is 3 points should be in contact with the ground, and that is the inner heel, the ball of the first toe, and the ball of the fifth toe. But to allow pronation to happen, you want to be a little heavier on the inside points, the heel and the ball of first toe. Just don't let your pinky toe lift up when this happens. Pinky's up, great for T, but terrible for split squats. Now the back foot's job is to push into the lead leg, turning the pelvis. For this, staying heavier on the ball of the first toe and the big toe while keeping the knees soft is key. Next up is the breath, and breathing is super important during the split squat. Aside from potentially dying if you don't do it, the breath ensures that you create adequate trunk pressure to lift heavy stuff. And it also promotes the pelvic floor actions needed to go through the full split squat range without cheating. At the top, I like to coach a full breath cycle. Go with the slow breath in through the nose for a 3 to 5 count, and then exhale softly through the mouth for a 3 to 5 count. You only want to move about 75% of your air. Then, once we get into the movement, keep it pretty simple. Inhale as you go down, exhale as you come up. Now this does change as the loads get heavy, meaning less than a 6 rep max, as there's a breath hold component that can happen to make sure you generate enough pressure to lift heavy weights. But for most other variations, the breathing sequence I talked about, slow on the way down, inhale, slow on the way up, exhale, works pretty well. And lastly, and most important, the movement cues of a split squat. With this exercise, we are thinking about encouraging an up and down movement of the body and biasing progressive loading into the lead leg. So it's more of a straight down and forward motion. The forward motion being created by pushing through the back leg. A simple cue that I use is pretend you're doing this exercise in a phone booth or a small box. Or if you're too young to know what a phone booth is, think kneecap down to the ground and front knee forward. Just make sure you keep heavy on the front leg. Now those are the ideals we should see when people are doing split squats, but more commonly, people will screw this up. First, stride length. Most people either go too long or too short. Both of these reduce the pelvic rotation needed to actively load the lead leg. When the stride is too long, usually the back arches, and either people don't feel like much is happening during the movement, it's all hip flexor, or they feel the back leg getting cooked. If you go too short, usually you see the spine round under as the back leg flexes, and this puts more load onto the back leg. Some people do this unconsciously, and it's just a cueing thing. Others, it's because of limited hip and pelvic motion. What I tell most people is to be about 2 to 3 foot lengths apart, keeping the foot contacts that we discussed in the previous section. Some people can also screw up stride width. This can be either too narrow or too wide. If you're too narrow, you'll often see the knees cave in, and that could be the front or back leg. And that's because you need some internal rotation to get into that tightrope position. If you're too wide, you'll see the same knee caving in, but this is because in wider positions, most people hang out in the middle of their base of support as opposed to loading into the front leg. The fix is to find a length that allows both knees to point forward on the split squat, which is usually 1 to 3 foot widths apart. Now in some cases, such as those with limited hip internal rotation, you can still go with a wider stance. It's just important to keep the depth shallow. You can also mess with externally rotating the back leg in cases of people with even further internal rotation restrictions. Now, even with a good stance, the split squat can be problematic if the foot contact isn't ideal. With the front leg, the most common mistakes I see are losing heel contact, spinning the foot out, lifting the arch, tipping the foot, or gripping the toes. All of these are a response to an inability or lack of internal rotation or force production into the ground. The key will be to keep the tripod foot that we talked about before, which is making sure you stay heavy on the heel and the forefoot points, ball of the first toe and the ball of the fifth toe. These should be pushing straight down to drive adequate pronation without using the toes to claw you into position. You can also see similar foot issues on the back leg. The most common ones that I see are keeping the back heel down while extending or straightening the knee, letting the foot spin out, or you just feel discomfort in the back foot. The key here is to make sure that you have a slight knee bend and that your heel is up off the ground. That way, you can use that foot to push into the lead leg as you go down, building the massive quads, glutes, and hamstring. Now, if the foot spins out, sometimes it can be because of a limitation in big toe extension. This also happens with pain. If you can't manually correct it, spinning the leg out into external rotation, like we did before, can help. Or you may need to use a variation that doesn't require as much big toe extension. Now, just because you have good foot contact, that doesn't mean that your coordination of the split squat as you go through the motion is going to be money, especially as you drop to the ground. If you don't go straight down, what I usually see is the back rounding or the back hip flexing forward, or I see the leg spinning away from the lead leg. Both of these can happen if you can't load into the lead leg properly, which requires that pelvic rotation. With either of these, the cue that I make sure people do is push the front knee over the middle of the foot and the back kneecap to the ground. Sometimes even using something to aim for like a foam roller can be useful here and also shortens the range. But if that doesn't work, you might either have to manipulate the load or rotational amount going into the lead leg. Stay tuned. Lastly, people often screw up the trunk position in the split squat. The biggest issues that I see are arching the back, rounding the back, or side bending, and that can be toward the lead leg or away from it. Oftentimes, fixing head position and getting a good breath can take care of those issues. And as you lower, make sure your chest and head stay directly over the lead leg. If you still notice problems, you likely need to adjust load positioning within the split squat. And the loading component is exactly what we're going to focus on next. Because if you can't coach your way into a perfect split squat, then you probably need to change something. Now, there are 3 ways we can manipulate loading this movement that can change the game. And that's through the leg, the foot, or through external loads, aka weights. Let's look at how changing each of these variables affects a split squat. We'll first talk about the leg. This is the easiest way to affect how a split squat looks. We can do this by elevating one of the legs. The easiest way to see how this works is by looking at a slinky. When When a slinky is even on the ground, the number of coils on either side are roughly the same. This would be akin to the base position of a split squat. But now watch, if I raise one side up, you can see that there's a lot more coils on the lower side, meaning the weight distribution of the slinky changed. Elevating a leg works the exact same way. When you elevate a leg, it offloads the weight on that side, and it puts more weight on the leg that's on the ground. So a front foot elevation offloads the front leg, and a rear foot elevation puts more load on the front leg. So you can see how this changes the way a split squat works. You change the load distribution, it's going to change the difficulty level, the range of motion demands, and how hard the legs have to work. When you do a front foot elevation, you see more of a vertical torso position and external rotation. And that's because when you unweight anything, you don't have to put as much force into the ground, and that biases the movement toward external rotation. This is often the easiest way to fix most issues with the split squat and more. If you make it easier because you can't load as much, you generally see fewer problems. But the key with this is you want to make sure that the depth is a bit more shallow too, since you aren't able to load as much into the lead leg because of the start position. Now, when you do a rear foot elevation, you'll see a more horizontal torso position and internal rotation. That's why this is often a more difficult exercise, and it can cook the legs way more. It literally puts more load through the lead leg. And that's why I consider a rear foot elevated split squat more of a progression than a first line movement choice. But leg loading isn't the only way you can change the movement. You can also manipulate foot positioning. Putting the foot on different surfaces affects how the split squat works. And that's because when you change what the foot's doing, it affects the shin position. This changes where your weight is at in space, which can affect loading, mobility demands, among other things. The ways that I change foot position on the split squat include using a ramp, either downslope or upslope, a sideways slant, elevating the heel only, or slanting the forefoot. Let's break down each. A downslope ramp causes the foot to be in a more supinated position. This makes the shin move more backward. Because you're starting more backward, it gives you a little bit more room to move forward from that start position. At low intensities, I'll use this for people who have limited external rotation or flat feet to gain motion. Now, at higher intensities, it's useful for people who are limited in internal rotation or who have more average shaped arches, just because you aren't moving as far into the internal rotation range when you start with a more negative shin angle. Now, the opposite of that coin is an upslope ramp. Here, you're starting in a lot more dorsiflexion, so it requires more foot pronation and subsequently internal rotation. You generally can't go as deep, but this is useful for someone who has a difficult time pushing the knee forward, and that's because it helps bias the tibialis anterior muscle more proximally, which helps pull the knee forward by pulling on the shin. And this is also useful for gaining internal rotation. But what if you're that person who has that crazy high arch? I'm talking like the outside of the shoe is worn and they have a super tough time getting the heel centered on the ground. That's where I found a sideways slant useful. Basically, you're meeting the person where they're at and then cueing the inner or medial foot points to drive a small amount of pronation with the eventual intent of getting the foot flat on the ground. Just make sure you don't make the mistake of using a super high ramp. You want it close to flat. Now, the limitation with this is because of the ankle position, you can't go into really deep ranges. That's where you eventually want to progress to elevating the heel only. With this, what it does is it shifts the weight a bit more towards the forefoot, which is useful if you're the person who tends to grip the toes on the ground, and you notice that first metatarsal head comes off the ground a lot. Because of the forward weight shift, it creates more of an internal rotation bias. This shifts your weight from the outside of the foot to the inside of the foot, which is a good thing. And the last position I use to modify the split squat is something awesome that I saw my mentor Bill Hartman use, which I call a forefoot slant. This is money for someone who has bunions. So as the shin moves forward, you should see the heel evert, or it should kind of tip inward into internal rotation. On the flip side, the forefoot, front of the foot, should twist in the opposite direction or externally rotate. In bunions, you basically have the opposite situation happening. The heel is stuck in a more inverted position and the forefoot is driving a ton of IR, especially through the first toe joint. So what you can do is you can use a ramp to externally rotate the forefoot, and a lot of times this will get some nice changes in bunion appearance and comfort. Now, so far, we focused mostly on changing what the legs are doing in a split squat, but there's something else that you can manipulate that can completely change change what is happening and working with this exercise, and that's where you're holding the load. When thinking about how load affects the split squat, you want to think about Isaac Newton. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. In less nerdy terms, the body will move opposite to where the weight is. Otherwise, you'll fall. Don't fall. There are about 9 different ways that I have people hold weights in a split squat. Let's go into each and when I would use them. First, reaching a weight forward. Since you're reaching the load out in front, this helps shift your body weight backward. And because of the arm angle, it promotes internal rotation through the arms as well as lower back mobility. It'll make your split squat a bit more hingy. This is perfect for those who tend to round the lower body on the split squat, because them going into a more hinged position is actually a bit more upright. Just make sure you keep the arms at 90 degrees, otherwise you'll be arching like a mother. Now, for those who tend to arch too much on a split squat, you don't want to weight far away, because it's just going to make them arch even more. But you still need something to shift backward. A goblet hold, keeping it at chest height, has been useful here. You won't get as big of a weight shift as reaching a plate straight out in front, but it might be enough. Just remember to keep the arms still as you lower the weight. The biggest mistake I see is lifting the arms up. Now, for those arched folks, if you've opened up some motion with the split squat and you really want to limit arching, you might want to do this on one side to drive a little bit more rotation. For that, I like a rack hold. Because this arm position biases more external rotation, it can create a little bit more room on the back side of the body to allow more rotation into the lead leg. That's perfect for those archers who are a bit more mobile, or the people who end up hiking the hip as they go down. Just make sure to keep the arm at about 60 degrees of shoulder flexion. But what about those times we have rotational issues? Like maybe someone is sweeping the knees away from the lead leg. That's where holding a weight on one side can be useful. Which side do you start with? If you hold on the same side as the lead leg, this actually limits how much you turn towards the front foot. And that's actually a good thing if your mobility to do that is like totally whack. You can then progress the range by switching hands, as this drives more rotation towards the lead leg. But if you're done with all that rotational stuff and you're using a split squat for straight gains, then you probably want to hold a weight on both sides. Now this restricts rotation overall, but it's going to allow you to work the legs the most. An easy place to start is with dumbbells at your side. It's classic and it still allows for some rotation because you aren't holding a barbell, and that's when I use this. But to me, I still don't think it's the best. The best to me is this Jefferson hold, because you can use a crazy amount of weight and it still allows for some rotation to be present because the barbell's underneath you. And because the barbell is underneath you, it assists in pulling you down into position, which is great for depth issues. Though this isn't the only way to do a bilateral load. Zercher holds are also vastly underrated. For those people who tend to arch or can more easily keep a vertical position, this is a great way to load the movement as it biases more external rotation throughout the body. So expect to be super upright when you do it. Now, to progress to a middle ground of external and internal, a front rack hold works well here, whether it's 2 kettlebells or a barbell. You still keep your weight shifted backward, but because the weights are in front of you and the arms are a bit more up, it shifts the bias more toward internal rotation in the body. But what will make this internal rotation city, and it also pitches you forward like crazy to cook the glutes and hamstrings, is holding a bar on your back. This is the classic way a lot of people load a rear foot elevated split squat. You can't knock the hustle. You can put some heavy weights on the bar this way, but it also requires a fair amount of mobility in the trunk to get into. In my population, peeps be missing internal rotation left and right, so it's not a bar position that I often use, but I do know some coaches who use this variation really well with a more athletic population. But now that we know split squat biomechanics, coaching, and how to affect the loading, how do we program this movement to ensure we're getting the most benefits? The way I typically use this exercise is either a higher rep strength exercise in the 5 to 6 rep range, or as one of my accessory movements where I'm looking at 8 to 12 reps. And that's because of the single leg nature of the movement as well as the rotation. It's not something that I find useful to load really heavy, because when you have an offset stance, you just can't create as much pressure. You create less pressure, you can't load as much. That limits force production. But it's still a wonderful movement for managing force in something that's more single leg, and in my opinion, it carries over to a lot of activities. Now, if you really want to up your lift game, then you need to try this exercise right here that you've probably never used, but it's probably one of the most vastly underrated hinge variations in the game.